My mother found me sitting on the front steps of my own house in -15-degree weather, my 18-month-old daughter bundled against my chest, 2 grocery bags slowly freezing at my feet, and my house key completely useless in a lock that no longer recognized it. I had noticed the locksmith's van pulling away from our street while I was still 2 houses down. I hadn't thought much of it. Our neighbors were older, always doing one thing or another to the house. I carried my daughter up the walkway, shifted the groceries to one hand, slid my key into the deadbolt and turned. Nothing. I tried again. I heard my daughter say "Mama," in that small confused voice she gets when something is wrong, and I felt the cold settle into me in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. My husband didn't pick up when I called. He never did when his father was involved. My mother answered on the second ring. She heard one sentence: "I'm locked out of my own house and it's -15 and the baby's with me." And she said, "Don't move, I'm coming." She arrived 11 minutes later. She pulled into the driveway, took one look at us through the windshield and got out of the car without even turning off the engine. She didn't ask me what happened. She already knew the shape of it. She opened the back door, lifted my daughter from my arms, and strapped her into the spare car seat she keeps back there. She has always kept a spare, ever since my daughter was born, because my mother is a woman who prepares for things. And then she looked at me over the roof of the car. "I know this is him," she said, meaning my father-in-law. "Get in, we're ending this tonight." Before I tell you what happened next, let me tell you who I am. My name is Brynn. I'm 31 years old, and until that February afternoon in Kitchener, Ontario, I genuinely believed that patience was a virtue worth protecting. I had been patient for 4 years. Patient through the comments about my career. Patient through the uninvited visits. Patient through the steady low-level erosion of every boundary I tried to set in my own home. My husband's father ran a mid-size real estate brokerage out of a glass office building near the expressway. He wore expensive watches and handed out his business card like he was doing people a favor. He had opinions about everything and authority over everyone in his orbit, and for 4 years I had been in that orbit. I work as a UX consultant. I help tech companies across Ontario and sometimes BC redesign products that real human beings can actually use. I operate under a numbered corporation, which is how most independent contractors structure their work in Canada once income reaches a certain level. It keeps your taxes clean. It protects you. My father-in-law thought it was a hobby with extra paperwork. My husband thought whatever his father thought. I should have known things were tilting when my father-in-law started commenting on my cat. Miso is a gray and white rescue I adopted 2 years before I ever met my husband. She is deeply uninterested in everyone except me and inexplicably my daughter. My father-in-law found her offensive. He said she made the house smell. He said cats were irresponsible around toddlers. He mentioned twice that he had a colleague who could take her off our hands. I had smiled and said that Miso was staying. He had looked at me the way a man looks at a door that won't open when he expects it to. The day everything collapsed started quietly. My father-in-law showed up at 10 in the morning without calling, which was typical, while my daughter was in the middle of her nap. He walked in through the side door he had a key to. The house was co-signed by him when we bought it. One of those arrangements that sounds like generosity and functions like a leash. He had his voice at full volume before he was even in the kitchen. I asked him calmly if he could please call ahead next time. My daughter was sleeping. I had made the same request a dozen times. He went very still. Then he told me that this was, at the end of the day, his house, that his name on the cosign was what made it possible. That I had been getting comfortable in a way that was starting to show, and that he had been lenient for long enough. My husband stood at the bottom of the stairs and said nothing. That was the real moment. Not the locksmith, not the frozen steps. That was the moment I understood. When I watched my husband look at his shoes and decide that silence was easier than standing beside his wife. My father-in-law left. 2 hours later, while I was at Zayre's buying salmon and frozen waffles, and the specific brand of apple juice my daughter will actually drink, someone let a locksmith into our house and changed every single lock. My mother drove us to her place, which is a 40-minute drive south, a small raised bungalow with a wood stove and my daughter's drawings already stuck to the fridge from past visits. She fed my daughter dinner, put her down in the travel cot with the blue giraffe, and then came to sit across from me at the kitchen table. I told her everything. When I was done, she didn't say I told you so, even though she had quietly years ago. She asked what I needed. I told her I needed to transfer money for diapers and essentials. I opened the banking app on my phone and navigated to our joint savings account. We had been building it for 3 years. $48,000, all of it from my consulting income, because my husband's salary went mostly to his truck payment and the things his father told him were necessary. $48,000. I had moved into that account, methodically, every quarter, treating it like a foundation we were building together. The balance was zero. I sat with that number for a moment, zero. I went to the transaction history, a single transfer made that afternoon while I was choosing between 2 types of canned tomatoes. The entire amount sent to an external account I didn't recognize. I looked up at my mother, she was watching my face. "He moved the money," I said. She asked if we needed to call the police. I set the phone down. "Not the way you're thinking," I said. Because here is what my husband didn't understand, and what his father certainly never thought to ask about, because neither of them had ever paid attention to how my work actually functioned. The joint savings account they had just emptied was not a personal account. It was tied to my corporation. I used it as my HST remittance account, the account where I held the harmonized sales tax I collected from clients, money that was never mine to keep, money set aside specifically for the Canada Revenue Agency. Those funds belonged to the government. Moving them without my authorization wasn't a marital disagreement. It was tax fraud, and the wire transfer to an external account was something FinTrack, the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, took very seriously. My husband thought he had left me with nothing. He had handed me exactly the weapon I needed. I told my mother to sleep. I stayed up with my laptop and a pot of tea and I started building. The text from my mother-in-law came at 11 that night. It was long and used words like erratic and our granddaughter's welfare, and closed with an offer. My husband was willing to be generous if I could be reasonable. Reasonable in her vocabulary meant coming back and apologizing to my father-in-law. I screenshot it and saved it to a folder I labeled evidence. By morning, she had posted on Facebook. One of those long, sorrowful posts that never quite says anything directly but implies everything. A photo of my husband looking tired. Prayers for wisdom and healing. Within a few hours, women I had sat beside at backyard dinners were leaving heart emojis. A woman from our street wrote, "So hard when someone won't see reason." I didn't respond. I screenshot everything and added it to the folder. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived from a family law firm my father-in-law had retained. It threatened an emergency custody motion citing my financial instability, my empty account, my lack of a fixed address, as evidence that I couldn't provide a stable environment for my daughter. It offered a settlement, return to the house, accept a postnuptial agreement giving my father-in-law oversight of household finances, stop independent consulting, surrender my equity claim. In exchange, they would drop the custody motion and return the money. I read it twice, then I replied with one word: agreed. I wanted them relaxed. Overconfident men make mistakes, and my father-in-law had already made several. Over the next 2 days, I did 3 things. First, I formally reported the unauthorized transfer of my HST remittance funds to the CEA, providing transaction records, the corporate account documentation, and the IP address logged at the time of the transfer. Second, I filed a FinTrack report on the suspicious wire transfer. Third, and this was the one I had been thinking about since the night my mother buckled my daughter into that spare car seat, I went through the property documents from when we bought the house. What I found was this. My father-in-law had listed our co-owned property as collateral in a refinancing agreement for his brokerage. In Ontario, both registered co-owners must provide written consent before a shared property can be used as loan security. There was a signature on that document with my name on it. I had never seen the document. I had never signed anything. I filed a formal complaint with RECO, the Real Estate Council of Ontario, on a Tuesday morning. RECO has the authority to suspend or revoke a brokerage's registration pending investigation. The investigation opened the same week. The meeting was Thursday at 10, at his brokerage office, 4th floor, glass building near the expressway. His choice, his territory, his leather chairs, his name on the sign outside. I dressed carefully, dark blazer, straight trousers, hair back. I left my daughter with my mother, who kissed me on the forehead and said, "You don't need to be loud, you just need to be right." When I walked into the conference room, my father-in-law was already seated. So was his lawyer, my husband, and my mother-in-law, who wore the expression of someone attending a proceeding they expect to go their way. My father-in-law smiled. The patient, mildly disappointed smile you give a person who has finally come to their senses. He said he was glad I had stopped making things harder than they needed to be. He said family wasn't something you threw away over a misunderstanding. I set my portfolio on the table and opened it. I told him there was one document I needed him to look at before we discussed anything else. It was the CR report, I explained, without raising my voice, that the joint savings account his son had emptied was registered to my corporation and used exclusively for HST remittances. The $48,000 was protected tax revenue, legally not mine, legally not my husband's, legally held in trust for the government. I told him I had already reported the unauthorized transfer to the CRA and to FinTrack, that what his son had done was not a marital financial dispute. It was wire transfer of corporate tax funds, a matter under the Income Tax Act and the Criminal Code of Canada. The room went quiet. The lawyer reached forward and looked at the document. I watched his face. My father-in-law began to speak loudly. He said I was twisting things. He would pay it back before lunch. His son had acted on his instruction and it was a protective measure. I said I understood that, which was why both their names were on the FinTrack report. My mother-in-law made a sound I hadn't heard from her before, not her Facebook prayer voice, something smaller and much more real. Then I took out the second document. I placed it in front of the lawyer and asked him to look at the collateral disclosure form his client had filed with a private lender 9 months ago. I asked him to look at the co-owner's signature. I told him that was not my signature. The lawyer looked at my father-in-law. I told them that I had filed a formal complaint with RICO and that the investigation into the unauthorized use of my co-owned property, and the signature that was not mine, had already begun. I told them that RICO could suspend or revoke a brokerage registration pending that review. His lawyer set down his pen. I looked at my father-in-law, this man who had shown up at my door without knocking for 4 years, who had stood in my kitchen and told me the house was his, who had called a locksmith while my daughter and I were buying groceries in the February cold, and I waited. He opened his mouth, closed it. Whatever had always filled that space, the authority, the certainty, the assumption that he was the kind of man things simply worked out for, was gone. My husband said my name. He said it in the voice of someone beginning a plea. I slid the divorce papers across the table before he could finish. Primary residence of our daughter with me. Standard access for him. No parental decision-making involvement from either of his parents. I told him that if he signed as written, I would not pursue criminal charges for the corporate fund transfer. If he contested anything, the CRA file, the FinTrack report, and the RECO complaint would all proceed on their own timeline. The lawyer leaned over and spoke quietly. I heard the words no path and license and exposure. My husband picked up the pen, he signed every page. My father-in-law didn't speak again. He looked at the surface of the table for the rest of the meeting. A man finally who understood that the room had changed. Outside, the February air was sharp and clean. I sat in my car before starting the engine. My daughter was at my mother's, probably knocking over a tower of wooden blocks, which is her current favorite thing. Miso was there too, asleep on the guest bed, completely untroubled by all of this. The RICO investigation concluded with a formal reprimand and conditions placed on the brokerage's registration. The lender recalled the loan. My father-in-law spent most of that year managing consequences that had come from a direction he had never thought to watch. By summer, the divorce was final. By the following spring, I had bought out the equity through the legal settlement, refinanced the house entirely in my name, and repainted the front door a shade of blue I had wanted, since we moved in and been told was not appropriate for the neighborhood. It is a very good blue. My daughter calls it the blueberry door. Miso sits in the window beside it most mornings, watching the street with the calm authority of an animal who has never once doubted her right to be exactly where she is. I think about the women who stay quiet because they believe quietness is what holds things together. I was one of them for 4 years. I kept making myself reasonable, kept assuming that if I just didn't push, things would eventually settle into something livable. But control doesn't reward reasonableness. It takes it and then it asks for more. The afternoon my mother drove to that frozen driveway and buckled my daughter into the spare car seat she has always kept in the back. That was the afternoon I stopped trying to fit into someone else's idea of what I was allowed to be. You almost always have more than they think you have. Sometimes you just have to let them believe otherwise, right up until the moment you lay it all on the table.